So welcome to another episode of Avestria's Women's Health webinar series. Today's webinar actually features one of our very first investments, which is Raydiant Oximetry, led by Neil Ray, who's the CEO and founder, as you can see on our screen. Before we get into his talk about Raydiant, about what they're doing to keep moms and babies safe during childbirth, just a few logistics. For those of you who have been on an Avestria webinar, you'll know how this works. For those of you who are new, here's how the webinars work. So first, Linda and Tracy of Avestria are just going to give you a brief introduction of Avestria, what we do, some of the companies we invest in, some of the members of the team. Then we're going to hand the stage over to Neil, who's going to talk about Raydiant. We'll have about 15 minutes to do a Q&A, but if you have any questions that come up during Neil's presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we will answer them during the Q&A session, which will be at the end of his presentation. And then we're around 9:45 or 12:45, depending on your time zone. We will say goodbye to Neil, and we'll talk a little bit more about Avestria and how you want to get involved. This webinar is being recorded, so for all of you that couldn't make the whole thing or want to replay it, we will send out a recording shortly after the webinar, likely tomorrow. And then this is an ongoing series, so please check your email for the next webinar, which will likely be at the end of the month. I think those are all the logistics. Again, if you have any questions for Neil, feel free to put them in the Q&A box during whenever the question strikes you, and we will get to them towards the end of his presentation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Linda and Tracy to introduce Avestria.
Thank you so much, Ava. So who's Avestria? Hopefully a lot of you know. In case you don't, we were founded in 2019. We're based in San Francisco. Our backgrounds are really as healthcare operators and investors with extensive industry networks. We only do healthcare because that's the only thing we know, and even that's pretty hard. Tracy and I have known each other for well over a decade, and then we've known Ava and Michelle for that long or even longer. We focus on investing in women's health, early stage companies. Next slide. So in terms of what our investment universe is, again, early stage, that means Series Seed and Series A. And the way we define women's health is there are conditions that affect women exclusively, disproportionately, or differently. So that can mean reproductive health, menopause, Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative disease, autoimmune disease, cardiovascular, and oncology. So it's a very, very broad definition of women's health. The subsectors we invest in are devices, diagnostics, digital health and AI, life science tools, services, and therapeutics. We do not invest in direct to consumer. Tracy, can you handle this, please?
Yeah, so a large reason of why we're doing this is because historically, women are absolutely an underserved population in medicine, and I think there's high time that the sector is ripe for innovation. So I'm not going to read all these to you, but there's definitely tailwinds in terms of the current understanding and how women are different than men biologically, from cells and tissues all the way up to obviously our phenotypes. And so from a regulatory perspective, in the past years, the FDA, the NIH have started requiring additional diversity data. We've been seeing that from a clinical perspective in multiple indications that women's outcomes are worse than men. And that's not, and that's because we don't really stratify the data appropriately and look at insights stratified by sex. And then we're also seeing that the funding is behind. However, what we have been seeing in the past years is that there has been a women's health opportunity, and more VCs are starting to put money into this. There's starting to be more recognition of the importance of women's health. Merck spun out their women's health assets into a publicly traded company called Organon in 2021. And so that's very encouraging to have a large strategic exclusively focused on women's health. And we're also seeing things like the on the policy side, like the Maternal Omnibus Act, as well as the recently announced ARPA-H Women's Health Initiative coming forward to support these things. And so I think we're really encouraged that this is an important space to accelerate innovation. And I'll turn it back over to Linda to introduce Neil.
So I'm very excited that we've got Neil today. As Ava mentioned, this was our first investment when we first closed the fund in 2019. And I fully expect every woman who gives birth in a hospital in the world to eventually be using Raydiant's product called, Neil will tell you, it's called Lumera. So I think one day we'll look back at this and be really amazed that it didn't exist previously. Neil is the founder and CEO at Raydiant Oximetry. He was inspired to start Raydiant when he was a pediatric anesthesiologist and observed the number of unneeded C-sections that he was performing due to a lack of quality fetal pulse oximetry data during delivery. Neil did his undergraduate studies at Northwestern, received his MD from Rush Medical College, completed his anesthesiology residency at Harvard Medical School, and completed his pediatric anesthesiology fellowship at the University of Toronto. Neil is board certified by the American Board of Anesthesiology in both anesthesiology and pediatric anesthesiology. Okay, Neil, we're excited.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Avestria, for your unwavering support. Hi, everyone. So I have thank you for your time today. So in the next 20 minutes, my goal is to talk about our unrelenting mission to improve outcomes for mothers and babies during childbirth. We'll talk a little bit about our non-invasive fetal pulse oximeter called Lumera, which is designed to improve the detection of fetal distress during labor and delivery. And specifically, I want to talk about why that's so important for outcomes of mothers and babies. To date, we've raised about $12.5 million of seed and Series A investments, and we've received another $5 million of NIH and NSF funding. And we are using that funding to complete an EFS IDE study later on this year. Unfortunately, we asked Dr. Elizabeth Chereau from the March of Dimes to also join this conversation to give her clinical background, her perspective, as well as the March of Dimes perspective. She's at the White House today. She's working with Dr. Jill Biden, this new initiative to improve research for women's healthcare. So I think that's a valid excuse for not joining our conversation. So why we founded Raydiant Oximetry. So as Linda mentioned, I'm an anesthesiologist. I focus my clinical care on mothers and babies in the perioperative setting. And it's clear that women are the most important healthcare consumer, but the system has not been designed with them in mind. More specifically, when you dig in, we've got the worst maternal mortality of any developed nation around the world. A mother dies every 4 minutes around the globe from postpartum hemorrhage, yet 80% of these deaths are deemed preventable. This is actually a condition that impacted my family. My paternal grandmother died during childbirth from PPH, and it's one of those things that impacts not just one generation, but many generations. And also, C-section rates have climbed over 500% in the last 40 years, but there's been zero improvement to newborn birth injury. So it's those reasons we founded Raydiant Oximetry. And before I get into our technology, what I wanted to do was talk about why do we monitor mothers and babies during pregnancy in the first place? Because you can have a healthy mom with a healthy pregnancy, and for the first 9 months of that pregnancy, we're not continuously monitoring the baby. But it's when mom goes into labor, that's when we start to monitor the fetus or the baby. And the reason why we monitor the baby is those labor contractions are not only stressful to mom, but they're physiologically stressful to the fetus. What happens during a labor contraction is when the uterus squeezes to expel the baby out of the birth canal, that contraction squeezes on the umbilical cord and the blood vessels in the placenta. So a baby temporarily doesn't get any blood flow during a uterine contraction. Now, as a species, we've evolved to tolerate uterine contractions, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be around. But there's a small percentage, less than 0.5% of babies that don't tolerate uterine contractions. Those babies, they become ischemic, which is a fancy way of saying not getting enough blood flow as a result of progressive uterine contractions. From ischemia, they develop what we call hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen because there's not enough blood getting to the baby. And they're at risk for developing a condition called hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, or brain damage from a lack of oxygen. We as clinicians, we've known about this phenomenon for a very long time. And subsequently, in the 1960s, a technology called fetal heart rate monitoring was developed to identify babies that weren't tolerating the birthing process. This technology looks at the baby's heart rate in relation to uterine contractions to look for patterns that might be suggestive that the baby isn't getting enough blood flow and enough oxygen. Problem with this technology is that it's very subjective to interpretation by the clinician. Multiple studies have shown that if you ask 5 different clinicians on what the pattern of heart rate tracings looks like, you'll get 4 different answers. And multiple studies have also shown that this technology at best has the accuracy of a coin toss when it comes to predicting fetal distress. And the way we characterize that is low sensitivity and low specificity. And so this technology is associated with the low sensitivity, which results in high false negatives and ultimately leads to the failed identification of the distressed baby. This technology also has low specificity, which leads to false positives and the overuse of unnecessary emergency C-sections. And what's happened over the last 50 years is emergency C-section rates have climbed over 500% since the introduction of this technology because of the high false positive rate. So we as clinicians, we get an alarm that this baby might be in trouble. We subject mom and the baby to an emergency C-section, only to realize that it was a false alarm. The baby was okay all along. The monitor was wrong. And we end up telling mom that we saved the baby, we rescued the baby, when the truth is actually that it was a completely unnecessary procedure. And you can see that because newborn birth injury rates haven't changed over the last 50 years. They've essentially been stagnant. So we've been doing a whole bunch of C-sections in an effort to rescue babies, but we haven't done a very good job of rescuing babies because newborn birth injuries have been the same. And now we've added risk and complications to mother while driving up healthcare costs. So our thesis at Raydiant Oximetry is that the heart rate is the wrong parameter to be monitoring if you want to detect distressed babies. We need to be measuring the baby's oxygen saturation. Heart rate has served to be a good screening tool, but it's a poor diagnostic. And if you want a better diagnostic tool, the correct parameter to monitor is oxygen saturation. And so what do we know about the baby's oxygen saturation in utero? Well, the baby's not breathing. Baby's getting all of their oxygen from the placenta and mom. And the baby has adopted to live at a low oxygen saturation, anywhere between 40 and 60%. You and I, we live at 95% and above, but a baby is at a low oxygen saturation. And that's okay because they've evolved to tolerate this low oxygen saturation. But when the oxygen saturation drops below 30%, that's when the baby is at risk. And they're at risk for metabolic acidosis from inadequate oxygen supply. And so when the baby's oxygen saturation does dip below 30%, we know that the umbilical cord pH will drop about 0.1 units for every 10 minutes of hypoxia. What happens is the fetus switches from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. In the process of going to anaerobic metabolism, they'll form lactic, which will lead to lactic acidosis. So 30 minutes of hypoxia will lead to formation of lactic acid and a pH of 7. 60 minutes of hypoxia will lead to a pH of 6.7. And the reason why pH is so important is it's the best indicator that we have of the risk of a newborn developing hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. As you can see here, if the baby's pH stays above 7, the risk of developing hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy is relatively low. But the more hypoxic and the more acidotic a baby gets, the higher the risk is of developing hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. So it's based on this science why we believe at Raydiant Oximetry that oxygen is the correct parameter to be monitoring during labor and delivery and not just the heart rate. Now, we're not the first to think about this. A company called Nellcor developed a fetal pulse oximeter that was FDA approved in the year 2000. And that technology demonstrated that, yes, fetal pulse oximetry can improve the sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value for detecting fetal distress over the standard of care. We know that the standard of care has a sensitivity anywhere between 85 and 90%. Nellcor demonstrated that they could improve sensitivity as well as specificity and the positive predictive value. The issue with the Nellcor technology was that it was semi-invasive, had to be inserted through the birth canal and attached to the baby's cheek. When used in outcome studies, the technology demonstrated that it could reduce C-section rates for fetal distress by 50% in 3 RCTs that were performed between the years of 1999 and 2006. But at the same time, the continuous use of this technology increased dystocia rates in 4 RCTs by 100%. As a result, a lot of high-profile organizations came to the conclusion that fetal pulse oximetry offered no clinical benefit because it did not change C-section rates. However, in the year 2009, the technology was used differently. It was used in an intermittent fashion versus a continuous fashion. And when used intermittently, it did not increase C-section rates for dystocia, but it reduced C-section rates for suspected fetal distress by 50%. So our hypothesis is that if we could build a completely non-invasive fetal pulse oximeter, we should also be able to improve sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value for detecting fetal distress over standard care, because essentially we're monitoring the same parameter as Nellcor did. But our hypothesis is also that by being completely non-invasive, our technology shouldn't cause dystocia, and it can reduce emergency C-section rates for suspected fetal distress without causing dystocia. And that's the genesis of Raydiant Oximetry. So we've built Lumera, which is a non-invasive transabdominal fetal pulse oximeter that we believe will improve maternal fetal outcomes by improving the sensitivity and specificity for detecting fetal distress. Our technology uses the principles of pulse oximetry to determine the baby's oxygen saturation. Pulse oximetry is essentially color analysis of blood. When blood is oxygenated, it's red. When it's deoxygenated, it's blue. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the color of the baby's blood. But because we're going through the maternal abdomen, we've got 2 bloods that we've got to look at the color of: mom's blood as well as baby's blood. We've got to differentiate them to make sure we don't confuse which color belongs to which patient. And we're able to do that because mom's heart rate is different than baby's heart rate. So we always know what mom's heart rate is, and we always know what baby's heart rate is. And we can use the fact that those heart rates are different to isolate the baby's pulse and then do the color analysis specifically on the baby's pulse. To date, we have 12 issued patents with another 46 applications pending. Our initial freedom to operate search has been very compelling, and we also have breakthrough status from the FDA for expedited approval. The breakthrough program is a recent program developed by the FDA to get breakthrough technologies through the regulatory process. To date, over 800 companies or technologies have been designated breakthrough, but only 4 in obstetrics. We're fortunate to be one of those, and with breakthrough comes expedited market approval or clearance, timely communication from the FDA, a flexible clinical study design, and a least burdensome path to data collection, and potentially the opportunity for additional NTAP payment through the TCIT program. Now, pulse oximetry is widely regarded as the invention that changed the paradigm of patient safety around the world. Pulse oximetry is used ubiquitously in the healthcare system, except for one patient, and that's the fetus. And so we want to bring this technology to the unborn fetus in utero, but the traditional methods for calibrating pulse oximeters cannot be applied to the fetus in utero, because the traditional methods for calibration involve taking healthy volunteers, briefly subjecting them to oxygen deprivation, and then simultaneously getting a blood gas to create a calibration curve. Now, no mother is going to allow you to ethically deprive her baby in utero of oxygen and then simultaneously poke the baby to get some blood to develop a calibration curve. So we had to come up with a new method, a new system for calibrating our pulse oximeter in order to make this technology commercially viable. And so we're using computational modeling and machine learning to do our calibrations. Essentially, what we've done is we've created virtual calibration curves through modeling, computational modeling. Everyone these days is talking about NVIDIA because of their stock prices. We've been using NVIDIA GPUs for the last 5 years to do our computational modeling and come up with over 7,000 virtual calibration curves that represent 7,000 patients of different sizes and skin colors. From those virtual calibration curves, we train a neural net and use a process called supervised transfer learning, where you take some actual live human data to teach the algorithm how to apply the virtual data to the in vivo human condition. And through this methodology, we're able to create a virtual personalized calibration curve that's been clinically validated. So first, we took this approach and we had to show that it worked in the pregnant sheep model. Using 11 pregnant sheep and 84 data sets, we demonstrated that our technology had an accuracy of 5.9%. When you compare it to Nellcor, the technology I mentioned earlier, Nellcor had an accuracy of about 5.3%. And this gave us the confidence that our approach of using machine learning and computational modeling was working, and it led to a successful Series A fundraising effort, which Linda and her team were a part of. Subsequently, we wanted to demonstrate that our approach would work not only in the pregnant sheep model, but actually on pregnant women. We completed a first-in-women clinical study last year in Texas at UTMB in Galveston, Texas, where we monitored 16 fetuses and obtained 101 data sets. And we demonstrated that our technology had an error of 5.2%, and Nellcor had demonstrated an accuracy of 5.4%. So we knew that our technology was working and that we had established a compelling clinical proof of concept. We also wanted to look at our sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value compared to the standard of care. And we demonstrated that we could improve sensitivity, specificity, and positive predictive value in the similar range that Nellcor demonstrated, thus giving, clinical utility to our technology. With the thinking being that if we could improve sensitivity by 10%, we could potentially reduce newborn birth injury by 10%. And if we could improve specificity by over 100%, that we could potentially reduce emergency C-sections by 50%. Now, pulse oximetry has gotten a lot of attention recently because of the accuracies and how the accuracies potentially break down in patients that are Black or brown. And we didn't want to have that same issue because we know that almost half the population that delivers babies in the United States is black or brown. And so we were very intentional as we were calibrating our pulse oximeters to make sure that they worked across all patient skin types. And we were able to do that with machine learning and computational modeling because that was an input in our computational models. We made sure that our algorithm was trained for not just white women, but brown women and black women. And then we also wanted to make sure that in our clinical study that we enrolled a diverse group of patients into that clinical study, and over half the patients were what we would call black or brown. And we demonstrated by enrolling a diverse population and training our algorithm with the diverse population, we could essentially get the same root mean square across all patient skin types. And this is really important for us to make sure that our technology serves, an health equity and global health access strategy. So to date, we've had 4 pre-submission meetings with the FDA and 5 sprint discussions to talk about our data development plan. Our intended use is that Lumira measures fetal oxygen saturation. The indication for use is that it is used with fetal heart rate monitors to diagnose fetal hypoxia during category 2 fetal heart rate tracings. We presented our recent clinical data to the FDA, and the FDA recommended that we move forward with an EFS IDE application to study 10 to 15 patients using the Nellcore OxyFirst technology as our ground truth to evaluate device functionality and device safety. From there, our plan is to go into a full IDE to do the pivotal study of 160 patients to establish our accuracy, sensitivity, specificity across all different patient demographics. And then on a post-market basis, our plan is to show that our technology can improve maternal fetal outcomes by reducing C-section rates, keeping babies out of the NICU. We want to show also that our technology can improve the patient experience, the clinician experience, and improve the health economics associated with labor and delivery. In terms of health economics, emergency C-sections are bad for the bottom line when it comes to hospital administration. So we know that emergency C-sections increase the length of stay of mom from about 3 days to over 5.5 days. Emergency C-section rates also subject mom to an increased risk of death, postpartum wound infection, and babies are more likely to end up in the NICU as a result of an emergency C-section. So when it all boils down to is hospital costs are significantly higher of an emergency C-section than an elective C-section, almost double the hospital cost. But when it comes to the third-party payers, they don't differentiate between elective and emergency C-sections. They pay the same. So you can see that, emergency C-sections erode hospital profitability because the DRG bundled care payment system doesn't differentiate between an elective and emergency C-section. And currently, when it comes to Medicaid payment isn't paying enough money to support the cost of an emergency C-section. So hospitals are losing money when they do emergency C-sections on Medicaid patients. And so our value proposition is that by improving specificity by 100%, we could potentially reduce these emergency C-section rates by 50%. And that would be very attractive to the hospital bottom line. We also want to build our technology to integrate into existing monitoring platforms to minimize the capital barrier for entry and minimize changes to clinical workflows. We've done a willingness to pay assessment, and hospitals have said, given our sensitivity and specificity improvements, they'd be willing to pay up to $400 per disposable sensor, giving us a 90% gross margin at scale. And again, through the breakthrough program, there may be an opportunity for additional reimbursement for hospitals to use our technology through the TCET program that is currently getting approved by CMS. Very quickly, We're in the middle of a Series A3 $5 million extension round. The goal of this round is to complete that EFS IDE study. From there, we'll have the final design specifications for our commercial product, and we'll be raising a $20 million Series B to do our pivotal study and get the product to market. We wouldn't be where we are without an incredible team of passionate individuals with deep expertise in pulse oximetry, the clinical practice of labor and delivery, and expertise in women's healthcare innovation. We're also supported by some of the best minds in biophotonics and obstetrics and gynecology. Our board of directors has tremendous commercial experience, and we are supported by venerable institutions such as the Fogarty Institute, March of Dimes, Global Health Impact Fund, Avestria, the National Science Foundation, and the NIH. I think there I'll leave it and open it up for Q&A.
Thanks, Neil. So for those of you who joined a little bit late, this is our Q&A portion of the call. So feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. We already have some questions coming in. The first one is actually just a definition question. Neil, can you just define dystocia for us, just for those of us who aren't familiar?
Yeah, so dystocia is basically when the baby gets stuck in the birth canal or fails to progress. And in those clinical studies, there is an increase of dystocia by 100% when the Nellcor technology was being used. And so some felt that the technology itself may have caused mechanical obstruction to labor progressions.
Wow. Okay. That was something I'm not sure I knew that there was a word for, the things that you learn working in healthcare every day. And then just sort of a historical question. So you talked a lot about how fetal heart rate monitoring is actually not helpful and is in fact harmful to mothers and babies. But how exactly did that become the standard of care, knowing its risks? Did we just notice the risks in hindsight, or was that something that was always there and it just became the standard of care for another reason?
Yeah, I think there are two big things that happened with fetal heart rate monitoring. It was launched before it was studied. And so no one, that was the problem number one. Then problem number two is it became a legal standard of care versus a clinical standard of care. And so clinicians have been compelled to use it to CYA for medical legal reasons rather than improvement in patient care. I'd say those are the two top factors. I wish Dr. Shiro was here. She could talk a little bit more about this, but that's why this technology, despite showing that it actually harms patients, is still being used today.
So just to summarize, especially for the legal portion, is that if a doctor were sued because something happened to the mom or the baby, the fetal heart rate monitoring is the standard of care, so they couldn't be necessarily accused of medical malpractice. Is that what you're getting?
That's the perceived risk of not using it.
Okay, good to know. And then just a couple of questions of what is happening during childbirth. Why would a baby's heart rate decline if it were not in distress?
Yeah, so a baby's heart rate can change for various reasons. And one of the reasons is that the contractions are pushing on the head. So it's a vagal response. And it's a completely normal response that there's a change in the baby's heart rate when there's pushing on the head. It's called the category 2 tracing. That's one of the reasons you can have a category 2 fetal heart rate tracing. So not all changes in the baby's heart rate are necessarily ominous. But the problem is we as clinicians don't know when the change in the heart rate is ominous versus normal or not ominous.
And in those cases, the clinicians would rather be conservative?
That's right. Because if you thought that the changes in the heart rate were normal or non-ominous, but failed to act upon it, and then you delivered a brain damaged baby, that's a horrible consequence.
Yeah, for everyone involved.
That's
really.
right.
But so it wouldn't, would it? How about rephrasing this question? So when a clinician looks at fetal heart rate tracing, is it not obvious what is happening? Or is it obvious? Or is it just that it could be obvious, but they still want to be conservative and avoid those adverse outcomes?
No, that's a great question, and something I did mention because I didn't have enough time. But so fetal heart rate tracings are lumped into three categories: category 1, 2, and 3. Category 3 is ominous and obvious and requires immediate intervention, but it only happens 5% of the time. And then category 1 is obvious and reassuring, but it happens 15% of the time. So then there's the rest of the 80% of the women or that get what we call category 2 tracings. And in that situation, it's neither obvious nor ominous what the tracing is showing. And there's been a lot of research effort to try to figure out which category 2 tracings are normal versus abnormal. But the reality is the majority of them are majority of the babies with category 2 tracings are going to be just fine. We as clinicians just don't know which ones they are. And so that's the bane of clinical practice. You're taking care of a mom, and 80% of the time she has a tracing. That's a big double question mark, and clinicians aren't sure what to do with it.
And one thing I've heard here too, Neil, just to jump in and just to share, one thing I thought was really compelling when we heard this in our diligence, when we were talking to a lot of clinicians, right? They would say basically, if you have 10 fetal heart tracings, right? If they're read either by 10 different clinicians, you're going to get 10 different readings. And even if you give them, or if you give one tracing to the same clinician, maybe 10 different times, right? You might get a different reading from them at a different point in time, right? So there's very little concordance between physicians, or even a physician looking at a different heart rate tracing at a different point in time. So it's really challenging, right, in terms of that. So it's yeah. So I thought that was really that really helped me understand how challenging it was, right? Because as a medical student, it was hard for me to read those, but I was really surprised to know that as folks get more experience, that doesn't necessarily translate into more confidence.
It's reading tea leaves. That's how it's described. And so what we believe Raydiant will do is give objective information that's very binary. The baby's healthy or the baby's not healthy. And that will help improve communication as well as the care model.
And so going back to what you said earlier, and then also jumping off of Tracy's point, when nurses see a fetal heart rate tracing, when do they know to call the doctor? Or is it just one of those things where they have to make a judgment call based on sort of unbiased data or data that is open to interpretation?
Yeah, it's a really hard call for nurses to inform the physician, especially in the middle of the night, and if the physician has to drive in to assess the patient, because the nurses know that if a doctor is going to come in to assess the patient in the middle of the night, there's a high likelihood that woman's going to get a C-section. And so they don't necessarily want to make the call unless they're 100% sure that something's not right. But no one's 100% sure because the information you're getting has such a low positive predictive value and accuracy that it's again worse than a coin toss. You're making a life-altering decision based on a decision that at best is as good, about the equivalent of a coin toss.
And it's a double life-altering condition because you've got both the mother and the baby. So
that's right.
Incredibly scary. We have a question about Lumera specifically. And so can you explain why this is a class 3 device?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because it's non-invasive. So you would think that it would be a class 1 or class 2 device. And what the FDA has realized is that our technology is going to be used to make essentially life-altering decisions. And if our technology is wrong, it can really harm a patient. Imagine if we said the baby's oxygen saturation is normal, but it wasn't. it was actually low. Now that clinician didn't do a C-section or intervene, and that baby ultimately developed brain injury as a result of our information being wrong. So it's that scenario when the FDA looks into the risk benefit analysis of our technology, they deem it to be class 3 because of how it's going to be used. And that's one of the challenges of women's healthcare. A lot of our technologies are used in ways that are life altering. And so the regulatory burden ends up being a little bit harder. Everything in women's healthcare is a little bit harder, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is just one
Unfortunately.
example.
So speaking of women's healthcare, just sort of generally, is there something that women can do? Maybe if they're not entrepreneurs, they're not investors, or they're not necessarily involved in women's health, but they're just a consumer of healthcare, that they can do to advocate for their own healthcare, improve their own healthcare? Is it, trying to advocate for themselves during labor as much as you can do that when you're pushing a baby out of you? Do you have any advice for sort of the average female healthcare consumer?
Yeah, know your hospital. Your biggest risk for getting a C-section is, what hospital you deliver at. If a C-section isn't in your birth plan, I would recommend know your provider, know your hospital. If you're a low risk, healthy pregnancy, maybe consider working with the midwife. Midwives are great, but they're not necessarily appropriate for all patients, depending on your medical history. I think those are things a woman who's at low risk and desiring to avoid a C-section could do.
Thank you. And I think every woman out there that's maybe preparing to give birth is thanking you for that. So we have one final question, which I think is one of the most important questions, is you've talked a lot about Lumera. So when can we expect to see this on the market, if you're willing to share that?
Yeah, our goal is to get through our pivotal study in 2026. So we will finish our EFS IDE study this year. We'll need to raise some money to basically do our commercial product development effort. So here's a mock prototype of Lumera. This is the sensor head. And right now the electronics are on the sensor head and we need to get them out of the sensor head so we can go towards a disposable sensor. And so that's going to require some money and time. And then once we do that, we'll go into our pivotal study. And the nice thing about our pivotal study is the follow-up time is fairly short. It's only 7 days, as opposed to other pivotal studies where you've got a 2 to 5 year follow-up period. So we don't think that our pivotal study will take that long to complete. And then we'll get this in front of the FDA and hopefully get an expedited PMA approval through the breakthrough program.
Wow, so that's really exciting. So we'll have to look out for that. Neil, we're going to let you go. I think that was our last question. For all of you out there, if you are an investor and interested in investing in Raydiant and supporting its journey, feel free to reach out to a member of the Avestria team. Linda and Tracy, at the end of this presentation, will give you the email address on the screen. But for those of you who want to hear it now, it's information@avestria.vc. So if you're interested in supporting Neil like we are, and you really want to follow his journey, let us know and we can connect you. Thanks so much, Neil. I mean, this was one of our first investments, but the more we hear you talk about it, the more we learn every time. And I think I can speak for the whole Avestria team when I say that. So we appreciate you being here today and appreciate you working to keep moms and babies safe.
Of course, and thank you for the support from the beginning. Avestria has been one of our favorite investors. So.
Thank you.